All right, I'm going to show you how to do the proving trigonometric identities problem type 1. This is similar to the verifying of identities, where you want to get the left-hand side to equal that right-hand side. Now, the difference between this type of problem setup is that they are going to have you show your work on that left-hand side and then also select the rules on the right-hand side. Now, as you do it though, you're going to hit validate for every single step that you do, and it's going to tell you whether or not that step was correct and simplifying. So again, something that you want to have handy is your pre-calc formulas for reciprocal identities, quotient, Pythagorean, and odd and even functions. So to start, tangent of x times cosecant squared minus 1. The first thing I see when I'm looking at this is I see that cosecant squared of x minus 1 looks similar to a Pythagorean identity. So I'm going to go to my formulas, and I've got cotangent squared plus 1 equals cosecant squared. If I subtract that 1 to that right-hand side, cosecant squared of x minus 1 will be equal to cotangent squared. So what I'm going to do for my first step is I'm going to rewrite tangent of x, and then in parentheses, I'm going to replace that cosecant squared x minus 1 with a cotangent squared. Now, to do that, I'm going to type in cotangent. Over here on the right-hand side, I'm going to hit exponent. That's going to give me the squared. And then I'm going to click x, and then end my parentheses. Now, what I did from this step to this step was I used one of those Pythagorean identities. So I'm going to click the box, and I'm going to hit Pythagorean. And then I'm going to hit validate. If it goes to the next line, that means you did it correctly. All right, the next thing I want to do, I'm trying to get this just to simplify to be cotangent by itself. One thing that I think I'm going to do first is I'm going to separate the tangent into sine and cosine. Now, here's what I do not know for sure. I believe if you're going to separate, I think it's going to make you do those each separately, like a step-by-step process. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that that's what they're going to make you do. So tangent of x, I'm going to simplify into sine of x over cosine of x. And then I'm just going to, I'm going to leave that right-hand side as cotangent squared x. Now, what I did was I changed tangent to sine over cosine, and that's going to be one of our quotient identities. Dividing sine over cosine is going to give us tangent. So I'm going to click that and then hit quotient and validate, and it worked. Okay, next I'm going to keep that sine and cosine, sine of x over cosine of x, but now I'm going to do something similar, and I'm going to break apart my cotangent squared. Now, I'm multiplying these two together. I think you could either keep them in parentheses or you can hit this multiplication button. I'm going to hit the multiplication button, and I'm going to simplify cotangent squared into be cosine squared over sine squared of x. And again, I just simplified that quotient identity, simplified cotangent into cosine over sine. So again, here I'm going to hit quotient, and then I'm going to hit validate. From there, now's where I can simplify. I've got a sine in the numerator and 2 sines in the denominator, and I've got 1 cosine in the denominator and 2 in the numerator. So I'm going to reduce and simplify one of these signs. So I'm going to reduce my sign in this numerator. That will cancel one of them in the denominator. So I'm going to have 1 sign in my denominator. So I'm going to give my fraction. I'm going to put sine of x in my denominator. And then I'm going to have a cosine in my denominator and 2 cosines in my numerator. So when I reduce, that one's going to go away, and one of my cosines in my numerator is going to go away. So I'm going to have cosine of x then over sine of x. What I did here was just algebra in order to simplify. So anytime you're reducing, you're going to select algebra. And then now I've got cosine over sine, and so that is my cotangent function. And again, all I did was simplify, but I believe what they're probably going to make you select is the quotient rule, because cosine over sine is cotangent. So I'm going to hit quotient and then validate. And it says your proof is complete. So once you do that, then you can go check. You already know that you've gotten it correct, and it should give you the point. All right, the next one that we're going to do is similar to the last one. We want to simplify this left-hand side, get it equal to 1 over sine of x times cosine of x. What I want to look for right away is identities that I can simplify. So I see this 1 plus tangent squared. If I go over to my formulas, I can see that 1 plus tangent squared is the same as secant squared of x. So I'm going to replace that. So I'm going to rewrite cotangent of x, and in parentheses, I'm going to write secant squared of x. Now what I did was I just used that Pythagorean identity. So I'm going to hit Pythagorean and then validate. Now I'm going to try, I guess, and see if I can simplify both of them at the same time. I'm not sure that I can, but actually I know I can't, because if I do cotangent and simplify that, that's going to be a quotient identity. But if I simplify secant, that's a reciprocal identity. So I know it's not going to let me do those as the same at one step because they're different rules. So I'm going to go ahead and do the cotangent part first. And cotangent is cosine over sine. And then I'm just going to keep that secant squared x. And for me, that was the quotient rule. Now I've got that cosine of x over sine of x. And again, I think you can keep it in parentheses or you can hit your multiplication. I'm going to hit multiplication. And I've got secant squared of x. Secant is the same as 1 over cosine. And since I've got two of them, it's going to be 1 over cosine squared x. The rule was the reciprocal rule. And hit validate. All right, now this is where I want to start reducing. So I've got a cosine in my numerator. I've got 2 in my denominator. So this one in my numerator is going to cancel. And then the one in I'm going to have 1 left in my denominator. So I'm going to have 1 left in my numerator because I've got this 1 right here. I'm going to have a sine of x, and then I'm going to have a cosine of x left in my denominator. And what I did there to simplify was I just used my reducing and used algebra. And you can see that that's where I wanted to end up at on this problem. So I'm going to hit validate. Your proof is complete. And then check. Okay, the last one we're going to do, I'm going to hit next. The last one that we're going to do is we're going to do 1 minus cotangent of x squared. So for this one, so your first step that you're going to want to do to simplify this left-hand side is you're going to want to write it. It's 1 minus cotangent quantity squared. We're going to want to write that out twice. So in parentheses, I'm going to write 1 minus cotangent of x times 1 minus cotangent of x. Now, what I did was I just did an algebra step and separated those. I'm going to see if that's what it wants me to do for that first step. So I'm going to hit validate, and it is. Okay, so the next thing, once we've written it out twice, is we want to multiply these together. So we're going to take 1 times 1, which is going to give us 1. And we're going to take 1 times negative cotangent of x, which is going to give us negative cotangent. Then we're going to take negative cotangent of x times 1. So that's going to give us 2 negative cotangents. So I'm going to just subtract 2 cotangent of x because that's what we're going to have in the middle once we combine those like terms. And then we're going to take negative cotangent times negative cotangent, which is going to give us a positive cotangent squared of x. And then what we just did there again was just algebra by multiplying those together. So we're going to select that, and then we're going to hit validate. Now, for this next step, I'm not sure exactly what they're going to want, but what I do is I see an identity. I see a positive 1 and a positive cotangent squared. So if you go to your formulas, you're going to see you've got cotangent squared plus 1 is the same as cosecant squared. I don't know if they're going to want you to put that together first before substituting it, or if they're going to let you substitute right away. I'm going to see if they're going to let you substitute right away because we've got that positive one and because we've got that cotangent. So we're going to type in cosecant squared of x because we're substituting for that positive one and that cotangent. And then left over, we're going to have that -2 cotangent x. Now, what I did was I just used that Pythagorean identity. So I'm going to hit validate. I'm going to see if it works. And it worked. So you're not going to have to put those next to each other necessarily before you go ahead and substitute. If they're separate from each other, you can substitute on that one step. And then you can hit check.